Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our homepage and remind everyone here in-house to please be sure cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our presenters. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentations, and our internet viewers are always reminded that you can send questions or comments at any time simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Introducing our special guest is Norbert Michel. Dr. Michel is Research Fellow in Financial Regulations in our Thomas Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He focuses on housing finance, the best way to address difficulties at large financial companies, and also examines and researches monetary policy and other issues related to the Federal Reserve. Please join me in welcoming Norbert Michel. Norbert?
Morning. Thank you all for coming. We're here today, of course, because this date marks 5 years since President Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act into law, otherwise known as just Dodd-Frank. The bill was by far the most expensive rewrite of our financial laws since the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. Back in the 30s, Congress passed actually several bills instead of one massive bill. But there are still many parallels between Dodd-Frank and those collective changes back during the Depression. In both cases, for instance, Congress blamed the crisis on speculation in risky investments and pretty much all but ignored the more straightforward and, I would say, more accurate explanations of regulatory failure. In both cases, Congress established a new framework that allowed federal regulators to get much more involved in financial markets than they previously were able to do, even though many of the changes that they forced upon markets had very little to do with either crisis. In the 1930s, this really just meant that regulators would no longer focus on disclosure and fraud prevention and instead finally start to actually decide which market structures and which investments would be deemed safe. So in one respect, Dodd-Frank is sort of a continuation of what was started back then. We're not going to dissect every piece of Dodd-Frank today. That would be more than one event. But instead, our focus is really kind of on one of the stated main purposes in the bill. And this is actually in the statute. The idea that Dodd-Frank will end too big to fail and that it will protect the American taxpayer by ending bailouts. So that's sort of the broad theme of our event today. Has this bill really succeeded in ending too big to fail? And Senator Richard Shelby will open our discussion with introductory remarks. He's graciously agreed to do a little bit of question and answer after that, and then we will follow up with a panel discussion hosted by my colleague Diane Katz, who's a senior research fellow in regulatory policy here at Heritage. Senator Shelby was first elected to the U.S. Senate in 1986, and he is currently the chairman of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, otherwise known as the Banking Committee. It's easier to remember. So prior to his election in the Senate, the senator actually served 4 terms in the U.S. House and 8 years in the Alabama state legislature. He has long been an advocate of smaller government, and he recently introduced the Financial Regulatory Improvement Act of 2015. This was the first significant reform bill to make it out of that committee in years. In addition to several hearings, the committee staff held many briefings on reform proposals, and the final bill was basically a collection of ideas that had previously garnered a great deal of bipartisan support. While the House passed numerous bills out of committee, and even several bills out of the full House, this really was the first serious attempt even in the Senate. So we are very grateful that he could be here today. If you would, please help me welcome Senator Richard Shelby.
Good morning to you. I thought I was in Alabama when I walked over here a few minutes ago. If you've been there in the summer, you know what I mean. I'll stay within my prepared remarks, and then I'll open it up to questions or comments, anything that you might have for me. Thank you for inviting me to speak here today on regulatory reform, and more specifically, whether too big to fail is a thing of the past. I've long held and publicly stated that I do not believe that any commercial institution, financial or otherwise, should be too big to fail. The mere concept in a free market economy is repugnant and I believe indefensible. If a firm is considered too big to fail, it will by default be viewed differently in the marketplace and be given preferential treatment at the expense of smaller firms. I believe this is anti-competitive and anti-market. It is also inefficient, creating serious negative consequences for the U.S. economy and ultimately for the taxpayers. Allocating resources through government subsidies rather than through free markets encourages activities and risks that would not be undertaken without government support. Failure is a part of capitalism, and those businesses that choose to take excessive risks should be allowed to fail. More importantly, they should know that failure is an option without recourse. Bailouts are the root of moral hazard in the financial system, encouraging banks to get even more bigger and take even greater risk. In addition, too big to fail policies and the bailouts that result from them can be applied unfairly, effectively deciding which companies will be rescued and which will be allowed to fail. During the financial crisis, all of you are aware of what's happened then. The Fed bailed out Bear Stearns, but not Lehman Brothers. It gave Bank of America extra incentives and financial support to acquire a failing Merrill Lynch. And yet, Citigroup's stock price fell from $57 a share to less than $1 before the Fed bailed it out. AIG received 3 separate bailouts, causing the government to own almost 80% of the company. As former Chairman Paul Volcker cautioned during the financial crisis, the Fed took actions, I'll quote him, actions that extend the very edge of its lawful and implied powers, transcending certain long-embedded principles and practices. In fact, a recent court ruling that you're familiar with held that the Fed went beyond the limits of its lawful powers when it bailed out AIG. It's clear to me that mistakes were made before, during, and after the financial crisis. For example, legislation claiming to end too big to fail and to address the root causes of the crisis, I believe, have done just the opposite. Instead of reducing systemic risk, Dodd-Frank has actually encouraged the biggest banks to become larger and more concentrated. It has put in place a structure where Main Street banks and other financial companies that had nothing to do with the crisis are treated as if they caused it. Dodd-Frank changed financial regulation in sweeping ways, including creating a council to monitor systemic risk, a new office to attempt to measure it, and a process to designate companies as systemically important, whatever that means. But it has fallen short, I believe, of the ultimate goal of actually reducing risk in the system. The current regulatory framework assumes that too big to fail is both automatic and unavoidable, instead of asking what it can do to reduce systemic risk. When I asked Secretary Treasury Lew at a hearing recently whether he thought it would be good to have fewer systemically significant financial institutions, I was surprised that his answer was not a resounding yes. Shouldn't this be the goal of Dodd-Frank, especially considering those who support it claim that it has ended too big to fail? The Financial Regulatory Improvement Act, which was reported out of the Banking Committee, was alluded to a year earlier, addresses this important issue by giving financial institutions regulatory incentives to reduce systemic risk. Dodd-Frank, I believe, imposed an arbitrary 50 billion asset threshold for determining which banks are systemically important, placing Main Street and regional banks in the same category of regulation as Wall Street banks. By comparison, the Financial Regulatory Improvement Act directs regulators to analyze the systemic risk posed by each bank above 50 billion and regulate it based on the bank's individual risk profile. More importantly, it incentivizes financial institutions to reduce risk by giving them a path to shed this designation. I believe that less systemic risk is a good thing. That does not mean, however, that we should have a system devoid of risk. Risk is a necessary part of our system, but our regulatory structure should encourage less risk to the entire system. That is the goal of the Financial Regulatory Improvement Act. Too big to fail is far from dead. We can, however, take meaningful steps to ensure a safer financial system and thereby reduce the probability of taxpayer bailouts in the future. I appreciate the chance to be with you today. I'll be glad to respond to comments or questions you might have. Thank you. Thank you. You're here.
If you would please state your name and affiliation. We have a couple of microphones coming around.
Hi, perfect timing. I'm Carrie Devra. I'm from the Center for Corporate Integrity. I'm also the investor that's behind Bill HR 1098, and that makes forced arbitrations of investment clients unlawful. I'm going to give you papers. It'll save a lot of time. But what if I said that Dodd-Frank says no account can be opened without the person present, with a post office box address on it, and without the person's ID and passport? Yet it happens. And Sarbanes-Oxley says that the respondeat superior is responsible for all of the failures beneath them, and yet they're not being held accountable. The problem is the regulators are keeping crimes away from.
What's your question?
So my
Sorry, do you have a
question is,
question, though?
knowing this, what are you going to do about it? Congress writes the rules. Will you pull back to the SEC Act of 1935 and 40 and start all over again?
You'd probably have to get me some clarity on what position you're taking and what you're doing. I can't, if it has to do with Dodd-Frank, if it's dealing with the SEC and some other regulation, I'll be glad to respond to it, but you need to get it to me.
I will do so.
Okay.
Hi, Lauren Windsor with the Undercurrent. You're from Jefferson County, from Birmingham, Alabama?
What's that now?
I said you're from Jefferson County. You represent Jefferson County?
Jefferson County? You're talking about the famous Jefferson County?
Yes.
That's where I was born.
Yes. Alabama's a lovely state, by the way. I have a lot of family in northern Alabama. But anyway, prior to Detroit, Jefferson County was the largest municipal bankruptcy. And so I'm curious as to whether or not you support prosecuting criminal bankers, one, and two, whether or not you support the regulation of the derivatives that led to the crisis in Jefferson County.
Let me tell you what I do. I think that people who break the laws, criminal laws, should be prosecuted, whoever they are, wherever they are. And oftentimes it seems there's not a lot of people pay fines, they pay civil things, but they don't admit guilt. If there's criminal liability, that's up to the Justice Department, but they ought to pursue that wherever it is. And that's why people would have more confidence in the justice system and our system of laws. It's very important, the integrity of the system, and it's not always true. At least it's subject to debate, isn't it?
But with regard to the derivatives?
What now?
But with regard to the derivatives and interest rates?
What's she saying?
Something with the derivatives.
The derivatives, would you support regulating the derivatives?
Well, that's a good question. Now, we went through that in Dodd-Frank, and we created a kind of a marketplace. Well, it already had a marketplace for derivatives, but we also tried hard to exclude the end user of derivatives. That's very, very important. But people who break the law, I don't care who they are. I don't care if it's derivatives or somebody's stealing something or cheating us or breaking the bank laws, or they ought to be prosecuted.
I'm sorry, you support prosecuting executives of banks?
No matter who they are. I think people shouldn't be above or below the law, whoever they are. If they're the CEO of X company, they shouldn't be above the law, because that undermines the whole justice system. I'm chairman of the Committee on Appropriations over the justice system. We and the FBI and everything else, and we tell them this: do your job, do it fairly, but do it with certainty, but do it. A lot of people don't do their jobs.
We have one more back here.
Yep.
Marty Shue, Commercial Real Estate Finance Council. I had a question Oh, is it going to move?
Well, that's a good question. The bill, of course, it was reported out of the committee. First thing it's been reported out substantively in a long time, I believe, and it's pending on the calendar. We'll see what happens this week. You know, there's a lot of back channels going on between members of our staff and others about what's substantive and what's doable. Because up here, I'm not going to get everything I want, but I'm interested in substance. You know, it's easy to pass something that it's not worth our time, you know, or stuff like that. But it's early. Don't give up yet. We think we've got the makings of a pretty good piece of legislation, and we're going to hang in there right now. Stay tuned this week, too. Okay? Sure. Somebody. Yeah. Go ahead.
Right here.
Yeah, take.
Good morning, Chairman. I was just wondering what your takeaway was from the CFPB hearing that the Senate Banking Committee recently had with Director Cordray.
Well, we had him up last week. You know, a lot of you followed that and so forth. But the problem with our oversight of that under Dodd-Frank, we don't have the tools to do the proper oversight of the consumer agency. It's not subject to appropriations. It doesn't even have an inspector general. You know, the inspector general is that of the Fed and so forth. I just think it's just going to grow. I think they told me the other day, I asked them how many employees. They got 1,400 employees now. How many are they going to have in 5 more years? Double that or triple that? We don't know. But I think it ought to have a council. I've advocated that all of 5. I think it ought to be subject to the appropriation process, and that's something we're not giving up on. Anybody else?
Are we good? We have any more? We have.
Right,
Let's
right over here.
we'll do one more
Still
question
over
back
here.
here, and then that'll be it.
Okay, you got your panel.
Thank you very much, Senator. My name is Ryan. I'm an intern here at Heritage. A few of your colleagues in the Senate are looking to move beyond Dodd-Frank and are pushing a reinstatement of the Glass-Steagall Act. I was wondering what you thought about this and where you think it's going in Congress. Thank you.
Well, that's a timely question, because you know the record. I voted against the repeal of, in other words, of Glass-Steagall when it did. I thought that, you know, there's a good argument to you have investment banking and commercial banking together, and we said we're going to have all the walls and protect everything. But I'm not sure it's been good. But it's with us. The question is, can you put it back on the shelf? Can you break it down? It'd be difficult. It would be difficult to do. And in some instances, debatable. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator. So now, if you can stay, hopefully you can, we have a panel, and I'm going to introduce right now my colleague Diane Katz, who's going to run our panel. She's going to introduce our panelists, and then we will have a short Q&A for the panel as well, I guess.
Hi, I have the privilege of introducing our panelists this morning. First, Paul G. Mahoney, who is the Dean of the Law School of the University of Virginia since 2008. He's also the David and Mary Harrison Distinguished Professor and the Arnold H. Leon Professor of Law. Paul's teaching and research areas include securities regulation, law and economic development, corporate finance, financial derivatives, and contracts. His book, Wasting a Crisis: Why Securities Regulation Fails, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, and I recommend it to you all. Among his many other accomplishments, Paul clerked for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please welcome Paul Mahoney. Kevin Cirilli reports on financial regulation in Congress for The Hill. He appears frequently on Fox News, Fox Business, and MSNBC, which we won't hold against him. Before going to The Hill, Kevin wrote for Politico, and prior to covering politics, he covered the Jerry Sandusky trial for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and Philadelphia Magazine. And then lastly, we have Norbert Michel. He's a research fellow in financial regulation for our Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He earned his bachelor's degree in business administration from Loyola University and a PhD in financial economics from the University of New Orleans. Before joining Heritage, Norbert was an associate professor of Nicholas State University, where he earned the Andy Bollinger Endowed Professorship in 2012, as well as the 2011 Excellence Award in Teaching and the 2011 Excellence Award in Research. And I did check, there were other contenders. Please welcome our panelists. So I would like to start out by asking about this. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew recently declared that, quote, Wall Street reform is working and that too big to fail as a matter of law has been ended. I'd like each of you to give me an idea of whether you think taxpayer bailouts are less likely to occur in the future as a consequence of Dodd-Frank, and whether the FDIC's orderly liquidation authority actually protects taxpayers and makes the U.S. more financially secure. Why don't we start with Paul?
Start with Paul.
Yeah, is that okay?
Sure, absolutely. So Sheila Bair said about the orderly liquidation authority that this isn't bailouts. In fact, it's just the opposite. Number one, we're not going to use taxpayer money. We'll take the money from other financial institutions. And number two, we're tough at the FDIC. We're going to wipe out the equity holders and we're going to fire all the managers. And that's all great, but I don't actually think it has much to do with whether this ends bailouts or not. I think the thing to focus on is what's going to happen to short-term creditors. Short-term money is nervous money, and when it sees a problem, it runs for the exits. And you can have one of two views about that. If you're a more market-oriented person, you would say, that's great, because it means that short-term creditors monitor the borrower. And if an institution is taking on too much risk, if it doesn't have enough capital, they're going to run for the exits, and that is your signal that there's a problem. The alternative view is that mechanism for disciplining borrowers is just too destabilizing for large financial institutions, and instead, all short-term creditors have to be either explicitly guaranteed, as deposit insurance does, or implicitly guaranteed, as too big to fail does. And instead of having short-term creditors monitor financial institutions, we have regulators to monitor them, and that's all more stable. And that is the system that Dodd-Frank anticipates, and it is the system that orderly liquidation authority anticipates. Because when the FDIC resolves a large financial institution, what it typically does is make sure that all of the short-term creditors get immediate access to their funds, very much unlike traditional bankruptcy where everybody has to wait in line and suffer some delay. So if you believe that letting short-term creditors do the job that capitalism has set out for them is just too destabilizing to the financial system, and that we ought to have regulators do their job and make sure that they are fully protected then you ought to like the orderly liquidation authority. If you think that short-term creditors have a job to do, even in large financial institutions, then what you ought to say, and what I think is the case, is this hasn't ended bailouts at all, because the short-term creditors know that they are implicitly guaranteed, and to my mind, implicit guarantees are bailouts.
So in essence, the short-term creditors don't know as much as the regulators here in Washington. That's basically.
That's the theory.
Yeah. Kevin.
Well, like, first of all, I'm kind of nervous because I'm used to asking you questions, Diane, and now the tables have turned, so go easy on me. But, I think like so many things in Washington, it really depends on who you ask. And if you ask Democrats, they will say that, I just interviewed Representative Frank before I came here, and he said that he thinks that the risk for too big to fail has subsided substantially since the crisis. But of course, Republicans will tell you that in essence, Dodd-Frank did little more than codify too big to fail. But the politics of this, I think, speak to the issue, and I'd be interested in your take on this, that clearly Americans are still concerned about big bank taxpayer bailouts. Look no further than what we're hearing from Senator Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Look no further than Hillary Clinton, who said just in an economics speech last week that she would appoint regulators who would be able to take on the too big to fail risk. And then look at Senator Ted Cruz, or to some extent former Governor Bush, who are also mentioning too big to fail on the campaign trail. So either way, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, the politics of this seem to indicate that Americans are still very concerned about the potential for there being more bailouts, and that we don't know what the next risk will be. Dodd-Frank did nothing to address cybersecurity, and it also hasn't touched housing, or to some extent. So I think that the risk is still out there simply because of what we're hearing politicians on both sides of the aisle say.
That's a good point. I think both sides definitely are in the majority of the camp, which is saying that we still have this too big to fail problem. If you look at Elizabeth Warren's individual Glass-Steagall bill, if you look at the Vitter-Warren bill that would add more restrictions to the Fed's emergency lending, those are both basically admissions that we still have too big to fail, so we have to fix it. I mean, that's exactly what they are. A couple things I'd like to point out. One deals with Title II, as Paul started talking about. In theory, what happens is and this is the first time that we've done it this way, right? So we've had FDIC resolution for large banks for a very long time, but now the way Title II works is you take the parent company and you basically wipe them out in order to keep the subsidiaries going. So the subsidiaries already know this going in. We've never done that before. This is new, and in the midst of that process, the only way that you can come into a Title II process is if the Fed and the FDIC jointly certify that there is no other private source of funding available to keep these firms going. So how we get from there to no bailout, I'm really not quite clear on. But that's what we keep hearing, and I just don't buy that at all. Even if you buy the argument that the Title II surcharges, the sort of like an FDIC deposit insurance fund, if those fees will pay for this, well, those fees aren't magically created. They come from somewhere. They come from other institutions, which are taxpayers. They come from eventually the customers of those institutions who are taxpayers. And if that fund ever goes dry, so to speak, then the additional funds come directly from the taxpayers. So again, I'm not quite sure how that gets away from a complete bailout. I just don't see that at all. And then the last point I'll make about this as to whether we have too big to fail or not. If you were going to design a system from scratch that didn't have too big to fail, the last thing you would ever do is set up a regulator with the power to identify the firms whose regulators believes their failure would actually cripple the U.S. economy. But that's exactly what we've done. You've now got systemically important banks, systemically important non-bank financial companies, and a new class under Title VIII which is the clearing firms, which we've never had before. And not only do you designate them as too big to fail, they have a completely new legal term, which is financial market utility, which I won't even go there. But it's a complete literal identification of the firms that we don't want to let go down.
Let me ask about another provision of Dodd-Frank, Title 11, which supposedly restricted the Fed's ability to engage in emergency lending. Do you think that it does, in fact, provide sufficient restrictions on the Fed lending programs like it did in 2008?
I could take that one first, I guess. No. If you look at what those provisions in Title 11 did, it basically said, okay, the Fed can no longer lend emergency funds to individual firms. Now it has to do broad-based lending programs. Well, that's basically half of what it did in the 2008 crisis. So roughly half of what they did in the 2008 crisis has now been codified. So, I mean, that's one major problem right there. In addition to that, they've tried to do some sort of solvency restrictions and things like that, which is what the Warren-Vitter bill tries to address. And I don't think that there's really any way to do that. I won't go into too much detail with that one, but the short answer is no. And the main reason that it's no is because they've codified exactly what they've already done.
I would just.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I would just add that with regards to Title 11, one of the 2 points. The first is that when you look at what happened during the 2008 crisis, there were no laws, there was no playbook that's something of which route or which map to take in order to navigate this. And so who's to say that if there was another financial crisis, the causes of which that we still don't know, the causes of every financial crisis have been different every single time. So who's to say that the Fed wouldn't act in extraordinary measures, as the phrase that we keep hearing in terms of what they needed to do to act in extraordinary measures, which is essentially we can do what we want. So I guess that would be my first point. And the second point is that if you look at any of the regulatory bodies, including the ones that were created under Dodd-Frank, whether it's FSOC, whether it's the CFPB, there's no question, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that the Federal Reserve has increased its regulatory power as a result of the financial crisis and Dodd-Frank. And so I think the question becomes, and in Chairman Shelby's proposal bill, exactly who's watching the Federal Reserve. Again, on the political campaign trail, you have people like Senator Rand Paul pushing for audit the Fed, which has a less chance of passing. But then you actually have some Democrats and Republicans in a bipartisan way working together that would actually reform some of the Federal Reserve. It would make some of the Federal Reserve presidents political appointees. It would shift some of the power away from New York to the regional banks. But again, there doesn't really seem to be an appetite in Congress to tie it back to Title 11. I think the issue that a lot of people are asking right now is who's watching the Federal Reserve.
So just to follow up, how does the fact that the Fed is now a much more of a regulator, how do we reconcile that with how they are supposed to be an independent and autonomous institution?
Sure.
Well, I would, so I'm going to answer a slightly different question, which is, why is the Fed becoming a more important regulator? And I think this is really an object lesson in how easy it is for a determined actor to take a bill the size of Dodd-Frank and find in it something that benefits them. So if you look at banks, large banks in the United States, their share of overall financial intermediation has been falling for 30 years as the share of intermediation done through capital markets has been increasing. That has made bank regulators less important. They don't like to be less important. And what Dodd-Frank says to them, or at least what they think Dodd-Frank says to them, is you can regulate just about anybody you want. you can find an insurance company, you can find a mutual fund, you can find a payday lender, anybody you want, and all you have to do is say that their failure would pose a threat to the financial stability of the United States, and you can regulate them. And what a great deal for the Fed. So we're going to impose tens of billions of dollars of additional costs on the economy because of a turf war.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at that, all the new regulations that the Fed is supposedly attesting to is providing a safer environment. I'm not really sure under which scenario the Federal Reserve would be expected to let one of those companies go down. I'd really like to see that.
And I mean, the agency turf war, I mean, as a journalist, that's like gold to cover. But look no further than what's happening with President Obama's proposal for financial advisors. You're seeing the jockeying between the Department of Labor and the SEC over who has jurisdiction. So it is very real. That's a great point. Yeah.
So FSOC and other agencies have been criticized for lack of transparency, no surprise, but in particular in determining whether and who to designate as systemically important. MetLife is challenging that process now and its own designation. What do you expect to happen with this case? Do you think that they have a chance of prevailing on it? Will the courts restrict them, or is this a lost cause at this point?
I'll jump in on the first half of your question with regards to transparency, because as a journalist, I mean, that people have to be transparent, and they're not. And I think that it is really interesting, and I'm relatively new to Washington, but to watch some of these government agencies criticize businesses of all sizes for not being transparent, and yet not providing meeting minutes or stonewalling in terms of months delays and Freedom of Information Act requests. It feels often many times like a double standard. And so I think with regards to FSOC in particular, where you have the heads of, I mean, this is essentially if you're like the all-star team of regulators. Every bigwig regulator is on FSOC. And the notion that these meetings are very opaque and secretive it's troublesome because it's difficult to find answers. Look at the House Financial Services Committee has been pressing the head of the Federal Reserve, who has met with when they meet with the Treasury Secretary about their meetings, and there's difficulty getting access to those meetings as well. And so I do think that I would expect there to be more pressure, particularly this election cycle, in terms of transparency with the regulators. But I'll leave it to the lawyer for MetLife.
So certainly the federal courts in recent years have been pretty tough on regulatory agencies that engage in fairly superficial analysis before taking a regulatory step. And so I think there is some real risk there. And if you look at the theory under which a MetLife, say, is systemically important, it essentially has to do with the so-called fire sale externality, which is to say, if MetLife gets in trouble and it starts selling off its bond portfolio at fire sale prices, then all of the other financial institutions have to mark that to market, and they may find that their own short-term creditors are running for the exits because they're worried that they're now in trouble. Now, traditionally, a life insurance company had a really good response to that, which is, most of our liabilities are insurance policies, life insurance policies, and people aren't going to die early to be first in line to get paid. And my understanding is that the response of the regulators has been twofold. One is, but many of your policies are whole life policies that have cash surrender value, so people could start cashing those out, because we all know that households and individuals get very skittish and run for the exits in a financial crisis. Now, it turns out that that's exactly backward, right? In the most recent financial crisis, it was not households who ran from banks and even money market mutual funds. It was institutions who ran. So the first part of the analysis is just factually wrong. The second piece of the analysis is, well, once we regulate you like a bank, then once your bond portfolio loses money, you're going to have to put up more capital, which means that you might have to sell some of that portfolio, which is a pretty circular argument. It seems to me that the response is, okay, well, just don't regulate us like a bank.
Well, logic never seems to win in these things. So, I think, and Paul's right. I mean, I think the courts have been pretty tough on the regulators for these sort of arbitrary lack of evidentiary kind of things. But I think this is a very interesting case, and I think MetLife has some really good arguments if you read through their brief. But I'm a little bit concerned because the way the statute is written, you can also make a pretty good case that FSOC did exactly what it was authorized to do. The only way that you can challenge the designation is if it was arbitrary and capricious. Those are the only grounds that you can challenge that on. And basically what FSOC says is, well, look, we have this whole detailed process here. It's a 3-stage process, and here are all the steps that we follow. So it's not arbitrary and capricious. MetLife says that the evidence that you're using is arbitrary. I tend to agree with that, but especially given the last couple of years, I hate to really guess at what the courts are going to say.
Right, although they have been very tough, as you say, on the SEC in particular, for their lack of due diligence in putting out regs. Let's take this a step further and talk about the asset cutoff for the systemically important designation. It's now at $50 billion, and regional banks, as well as other non-bank financial institutions, are complaining that they're wrongfully getting caught in this regulatory web. Should Congress increase that threshold? What's the likelihood that they will? Is there, perhaps Kevin can talk to the politics of this, but the other two can talk to the more substantive end of that.
Well, I think Chairman Shelby wants to raise that. I think a lot of Republicans want to raise that, but the threshold that he has proposed, I think is a good basis for a Republican negotiation. But I don't think that would be his marker is, I think it sets the marker, but I don't think it necessarily would happen. I would be stunned if it did. But on the liberal side, Senator Elizabeth Warren just the other week coming out very strongly against raising the threshold. She argues that this would, that a lot of these small community banks are in need of this regulation. So I think when you have Elizabeth Warren making this a public issue, that will rally the progressive base. But it's unclear whether or not that would hinder efforts from a whole standpoint. In terms of how that happens and where this goes in Congress, I don't really think that this president has an appetite for significantly reforming Dodd-Frank, and simply because it is such a legacy policy of his. But I do think that the next president, whether it is Hillary Clinton or a Republican, will have an appetite to do that. The question becomes whether or not progressives in the Senate would be able to stall or block such reform.
Well, okay, I'll add that I, first off, absolutely don't think that there should be any threshold or any process that designates these guys. However, if we're going to do that, $50 billion is ridiculous. It's absolutely laughable to say that the failure of a $50 billion bank is going to bring the United States economy to its knees. It's just absolutely absurd. It's just there's absolutely no grounds for that at all. It's completely and wholly arbitrary. Has no evidence of anything like that ever happening or that it could happen. Makes no sense. If you look at the asset sizes of U.S. banks, you've got basically 4 banks with more than $1 trillion in assets, and then there's a significant drop-off to less than $400 billion. And then you've got a group of about maybe 18, roughly 20 banks that are between $100 and $400 billion. And then you have another significant drop-off. So I'm not sure how you come up with any threshold that isn't arbitrary. But if it's something like 500 billion, then you've basically only got the top 5 banks.
And I think the only thing I would add to that is, I think it's pretty hard to dispute the fact that Dodd-Frank has been really, really bad for smaller banks. I think it's just, very hard to disagree with that.
Yeah, particularly among community banks, their share of the market has dropped precipitously. I don't know what's that, from 40 to 20% or something along those lines. So in thinking long-term.
And that, could I just jump in?
Sure,
And that is, I think it's important to point out too, that is a long-term trend. So Dodd-Frank is certainly worse than that, but it's a bigger problem. The whole FDIC resolution process is you've basically succumbed to the idea that we can never let a bank actually fail. We have to come in with the government and figure out how to reallocate these assets to another bank. And it's been concentrating bank risk for decades. And it's the wrong approach, but.
You're right, but the trend is much, is worsened.
This has certainly worsened it, and if you throw in the Title II stuff, then you could argue that it's going to worsen it if there's ever a Title II proceeding.
I'd like to ask Paul specifically, and then either of you are welcome to join in. How does Dodd-Frank, as a response, compare with past congressional responses to financial crises? And has there ever been such a drastic overhaul of the financial system?
Well, so I think Norbert did a very good job of pointing out the parallels between Dodd-Frank and the New Deal financial reforms, which were premised on the notion that that the crash and the depression were the fault of fraudulent securities sales, which I think there's actually virtually no evidence to support. But we don't even have to just limit ourselves to Congress. In fact, the first significant regulation of capital markets occurs in 1697 in England. And what happens there, if you'll indulge me for a second? Absolutely. Without boring you with the details, Parliament and the Crown's ministers decided to alter the silver content of the coinage. They completely botched it, which meant that there was a run on the Bank of England, deflation, and a severe recession. So as Congress would today, Parliament immediately created a commission to study the causes of the financial and economic downturn. And what did they conclude? It was the fault of the stock market. Now, this was about as ridiculous an argument as one could make, given that the stock market was incredibly small and not at all important to the overall economy. But Parliament made itself feel better by enacting a statute that limited the number of stockbrokers to 100 and giving the Lord Mayor of London the right to decide who got the licenses. That tells you everything you need to know about financial regulation ever since. Okay, that's basically the playbook, and that's what happens.
Yeah, I can't add anything to that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I want to hear more about that.
You should read Paul's book. There's a lot more in there on that.
Yes, and it does go a long way to explaining why government regulators always find that it's not the government's fault, right?
If I just add one more, I will add one thing. So this time is another sort of detailed parallel. If you look at the credit default swaps, right? So there's all this talk about the derivatives and how derivatives brought everything down, specifically credit default swaps of AIG. So point number one, AIG, although not a regulated bank, was a regulated company. Office of Thrift was regulating those facilities, and the biggest problem that they had actually was in their securities lending business. Second point, all the reforms that Dodd-Frank throws on the derivatives market, specifically asking for derivatives to now clear, that's this big reform idea, where even some credit default swaps would be cleared. The kind that AIG used would probably never be cleared, even under the new rules. So it doesn't even touch that stuff. So that's the only thing I'm going to add.
I'm going to ask a question about consumers, the effect on consumers of the Dodd-Frank capital requirements, but also in conjunction with Basel and Volcker rule and derivatives restrictions. What is it all doing to liquidity? And are those costs being being imposed on customers at this point? Or will they be?
Chairman Henserling, later this afternoon, he's been making a lot of speeches with the Dodd-Frank anniversary, but later this afternoon, will make remarks arguing this point exactly, that consumers have felt the brunt of unintended consequences of Dodd-Frank at the grocery store and Main Street businesses all throughout the country. I think any time that you have too much regulatory red tape, that especially the Republicans make this argument that if there's too much regulatory red tape in terms of small businesses and they're having to follow rules that were prescribed for big banks, obviously that's going to increase their costs. I think politically, and I would just go back to the last question real quick, politically, the finger pointing is only going to continue this election cycle. And if you look at what happened in the midterms just a year ago with Republicans taking back control, it was largely because the frustration that voters felt about the impish pace of the economic recovery, and they blamed the White House. Now, if you have Hillary Clinton, look for Republicans to finger point that it was that her husband laid the foundation for the economic collapse. That becomes a questionable debate in terms if you have her going up against a Bush in terms of that argument. But I think on the issue of economics and who's to blame, that's going to be a huge issue as we move forward into this cycle. Yeah.
Paul, what about liquidity?
No.
Are we seeing a dramatic or even measurable impact?
So we've certainly seen significant declines in liquidity in the bond markets. The debate is really over what's causing it. There's a recent paper that at least tries to tease out whether capital requirements are having a big impact and concludes that they aren't. I think a lot of folks in Washington have taken that and concluded that therefore regulation is not to blame at all, which is not the case. I think the Volcker rule probably has more likely had an impact on liquidity. But it's early days in terms of really digging down to the bottom of that problem.
No, I agree. It is a little early to say for sure. I think it also is a little tricky because it depends on exactly how you define liquidity. I think you can make a very good case that the supply of a lot of liquid assets has dried up. And I think that will or could impact liquidity going forward, although I don't know that that's really the same exact thing as liquidity based on the traditional definition. Now, and the supply, I think you'd have a really easy case to make that this is because of what we've done. You've got new regulations that raise the actual equity requirements for a lot of the large banks and financial institutions. At the same time, you're making them hold on to liquid assets for no other reason than to hold on to them. And then at the same time, with something like Volcker and other trading rules, you're basically getting rid of a bunch of dealers who normally hold these things as inventory. So, of course, you've done something to the supply. There's no doubt. You've taken a large swath off the market. There's not an unlimited supply of these things, and there's not an unlimited supply of people with money willing to buy these things. So if you force them to buy something else like equity, then that's going to have an impact, and that's what we've done.
The other thing I would just note, and this is a little bit more just sort of speculative a priori kind of reasoning, but if you look at the pricing of financial assets, every pricing model that exists keys off of a risk-free rate. There has not been a market-determined risk-free rate basically now for 6 years, and that's got to, I think, have some effect on the willingness of traders to make really deep and liquid markets, because ultimately they're not really sure, I suspect, what the real risk-free rate is today.
There's also similar uncertainty about the effects on whether too big to fail is a benefit to banks or is not a benefit to banks, and how that affects their ability to raise their funds and so on. Does anyone want to address that?
Well, yeah, I would just say, I think, I think it really just depends on the day. I mean, if there's a financial collapse and a big bank feels like they're going to get bailed out, I'm sure they would be, to some extent, I don't want to say supportive, but I mean, it's there as a crutch. But, obviously I'm sure it's bad for business and their stock if they get a bailout. But, so I think it acts as a crutch in that regard. But it also gives the government more of more say in terms of their regulatory power. So I think it's a double-edged sword for them. But again, to go back to the first question, clearly we're still talking about too big to fail. So it's tough to say that it's not the ghost or the shadow that's haunting over this whole entire debate.
That's true. No, that's exactly right. And it's hard to, everybody wants a number. And, it's really hard to come up with an exact number. The effect's obviously there because we're still talking about this. I'm not sure what the number is, though.
So before we take questions from the audience, does anyone have anything they'd like to add?
I would just make one more small point about too big to fail, and that is that I think whatever else the statute does, it is going to be politically a challenge the next time a large financial institution fails, especially if it's an institution that the regulators have completely wrapped their tentacles around and are actually getting involved in day-to-day business decisions as they are in some of these firms, to say, you guys messed up, it's your problem, we're not going to bail you out. I think that politically that's just, I think, going to be a very hard sell.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, and that might be the one good thing to come out of all this. If you look at the last crisis, the same thing with the derivatives being unregulated. That's demonstrably ridiculous. If the bulk of the derivatives, the swap markets that they're talking about when they say that, interest rate and foreign exchange rate swaps, and roughly 80% of that market is large banks. They were all regulated. There are statements, public press releases from the 1990s, early 1990s, from the Fed, from the OCC, other ones in 2006, right before the crisis, also from the OCC, that specifically acknowledges, look, we know that these banks are doing these swaps. We know that there are different levels of risk, and on a case-by-case basis, we're going to look at everything, and we're going to make them incorporate this into their capital requirements.
So my last editorial comment is this, that there will be another financial crisis, primarily because Dodd-Frank did nothing to ameliorate the problems that created the 2008 crisis, or very little. Okay, so who has a question? Chad. Should I wait for a mic? Yeah, go ahead. Wait for a mic. And please identify yourselves.
Chad Reese with the Mercatus Center. I think a lot of times when we talk about systemic risk, it's so easy to go straight to too big to fail. And maybe just because I like being picky, I tend to go the other way and think about hurting risk. And I'm wondering, especially Norbert, since you kind of mentioned capital requirements, does the panel have any thoughts on systemic risk that comes not from a couple of very large institutions failing, but of regulatory activity or other pressures that might move a lot of the market into a particular sector, a particular product or activity that then becomes systemically risky because that then fails?
Yeah. And
if that's an issue, apart from just saying only simple capital requirements, risk-based, what are some ways that regulators might get away from that hurting risk?
Good question.
It's like if you have a barrel with a hole in it and you plug one hole and then it comes out the other side and you break the whole barrel. I mean, look at clearinghouses, right? And I think that's what you're seeing in terms of the derivatives. I mean, the derivative market, when you over-regulate in one area, you push the market into another direction. So I think that is definitely an issue that policymakers are looking at. I put that question just, again, before I came here to Representative Frank, and he didn't buy it. He said that Dodd-Frank addresses that concern. But I do think but I do think it is an issue that policymakers are looking at. I would just add cybersecurity to this mix. I think it's something that, talk about a turf war, no agency has any idea in terms of how to regulate cyber if Target gets breached or if a big bank gets breached. Not to mention, just the other week, there was a huge breach of all government employees. So again, who's watching the regulators? How can the regulatory bodies mandate cybersecurity if they can't even protect their own data? So I think that is hugely under-discussed, but yes, I do think it is an issue.
I'd add that, again, you have to go back to just look at what happened in the last crisis. So I'm completely against the Basel risk-weighted requirements, completely and totally against it. If you're going to have some sort of statutory capital requirement, it ought to be a simple, flat fee, nothing else, not all these little risk buckets and all these little different games that we're playing. And make no mistake, it's the regulators playing the games. Go back and ask yourself, why did everybody have all these mortgage-backed securities? Because the Basel capital requirements gave them low risk weights. You had a distinct advantage to buy all of those that you could, along with the other federal policies that were pushing more and more of that type of debt into the system. But if you don't have the Basel requirements, you don't have the incentive to do that. So all of a sudden, what you end up with are a whole bunch of financial institutions holding the same thing. That's not how you, I mean, that's a very clear case of government creating systemic risk. Clear cut. But we don't want to talk about that. Well, I do.
Did you want to add anything, Paul? No, new question. Okay, next question. Okay, I have one. Yesterday, the Federal Reserve voted to approve new risk-based capital surcharges that will apply, I think, mostly to the 8 largest banks. It's been posited that this will give these banks the choice of either holding substantially more capital or shrinking their footprint, which is, a euphemism for kind of breaking up a bit. Do you guys want to comment on that and what you think this action, given that it's, I think, 1 to 4.5% is the surcharge that they're talking about, Paul?
Well, so, my preferred solution to the problem would be to say, let's just let creditors monitor these banks, and if they think that capital's not enough, then they can run for the exits, and then the bank will learn its lesson. That's not the solution that Dodd-Frank has adopted. So we're now in a world of second best, and the second best, I think you do have to have pretty stringent capital requirements, and they probably do have to get stricter as the bank gets larger. Wouldn't be the way I would run the railroad, but given that we're basically suppressing the best means of controlling risk-taking by large institutions, you've got to substitute something.
That's true. I mean, it's clearly not the best way to do it, but if we're going to take the best way away, then that's probably all you have left. Ironically, I think it would be better to get rid of all the Basel stuff and go with something like this, just a flat number. Not that I want this either, but it's kind of fun to watch some of the games being played with this one too, because I think it was Stanley Fischer said, this is a good thing. Some companies might want to shed some of their assets and shrink their size, to get away from that. So we'll see how that plays out. What do you mean by that? Well, they're hoping. I think GE Capital is one example. GE already said we were going to get rid of our commercial lending business. We're going to try to avoid being a SIFTI, but they still got labeled. And nobody really knows if they can actually shrink and get rid of the label. Like that's an open question. That's completely uncertain.
Well, how many times do you know of when regulators have actually, deregulated somebody?
Deregulated?
Anything else? Well, I'd like very much to thank all three of you. You did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.